Rich sat in the dimly lit common room of the ship, his eyes fixed on the holographic display before him. The team had been drifting aimlessly through space for weeks, taking on small jobs here and there, but lacking a true sense of purpose. He sighed, rubbing his eyes as he leaned back in his chair. The collapse of the government they once served had left them all reeling, unsure of their place in the galaxy. But Rich knew they couldn't continue like this forever. They needed a goal, a mission, something to fight for. Luisi called out, his voice echoing through the ship. "Can you come here for a moment?" The young tech specialist appeared in the doorway, his eyebrows raised in curiosity. "What's up, boss?" Rich gestured for him to take a seat. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice measured and calm. "We can't keep going on like this, taking whatever jobs come our way. We need something more, something to believe in." Luis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I agree, but what did you have in mind?" Rich leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I want you to go through the old data from before the collapse. Compare it to what we have now, and see if you can find any potential bases of operations. Somewhere we can call home and start building something new." Luis's eyes widened in surprise. "That's a tall order, boss. The data from back then is a mess, and a lot of it was lost in the collapse." "I know," Rich replied, his voice filled with determination. "But we have to try. We can't keep wandering the galaxy like lost souls. We need a purpose, a reason to keep fighting." Luis hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll see what I can do, but it might take some time." Rich clapped him on the shoulder, a small smile on his face. "Take all the time you need. This is important." As Luis left to begin his search, Rich turned back to the holographic display. The galaxy spun before him, a vast expanse of stars and planets, each one holding the potential for a new beginning. He thought back to the day the government fell, the day their world had been turned upside down. They had all lost so much that day: friends, family, a sense of belonging. But they had also gained something: each other. Rich knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They were more than just a team, more than just soldiers. They were a family, bound by the bonds of loyalty and love. And now, they had a new mission: to find a place to call home, and to start building something that would last, something that would give them a reason to keep fighting, even in the darkest of times. Rich smiled to himself, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in a long while. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he knew they could handle it. They had survived the collapse, had fought their way through countless battles and challenges. And now, they would find their new purpose. They would become more than just survivors, more than just wanderers. They would become something greater, something that would inspire hope in a galaxy that sorely needed it. With renewed determination, Rich turned his attention back to the holographic display. The search had begun, and he knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Luis sat hunched over his console, his fingers flying across the keys as he delved deep into the data archives. The search for a new base of operations had consumed him for days, as he pored over every scrap of information he could find. It was a daunting task, made all the more difficult by the fragmentary nature of the data. Much had been lost in the collapse, and what remained was often corrupted or incomplete. But Luis refused to give up. He knew how much this meant to Rich, to the entire team. He paused for a moment, rubbing his eyes as he leaned back in his chair. The numbers and symbols on the screen blurred together, a confusing mass of data that seemed to mock his efforts. But then, something caught his eye. It was a small entry, buried deep within the archives. A brief mention of a research outpost on a distant desert planet, used by the old government for classified experiments. The entry was vague, lacking in detail, but it was the closest thing to a lead that Luis had found. He cross-referenced the entry with more recent data, trying to find any mention of the outpost in the years since the collapse. But there was nothing. It was as if the outpost had simply vanished, wiped from the galaxy's records. Luis frowned, his curiosity piqued. If the outpost had been used for classified research, it made sense that the government would have kept its existence hidden. But why had it been abandoned? And what exactly had they been researching there? He dug deeper, searching for any scrap of information that might shed light on the outpost's purpose. But the more he looked, the more questions he had. The data was too fragmented, too incomplete to form a clear picture. Finally, after hours of searching, Louis sat back in his chair, his eyes wide with realization. The outpost might have been abandoned, but it was still out there. And if it had been used for classified research, there was a chance that it might still contain valuable technology or resources. He quickly compiled his findings, his heart racing with excitement as he made his way to Rich's quarters. He found the commander sitting at his desk, his eyes fixed on a holomap of the galaxy. "Boss," Louis said, his voice breathless with excitement. "I think I found something." Rich looked up, his eyebrows raised in curiosity. "What is it?" Louis handed him a data pad, the information he had gathered displayed on its screen. "It's an old research outpost, used by the government before the collapse. It's on a desert planet, and there's not much information about what they were doing there. But it's the closest thing to a lead that I've found." Rich studied the data pad, his eyes scanning the information quickly. "Interesting," he murmured, his brow furrowed in thought. "If this outpost was used for classified research, there's a chance it might still contain something of value." He looked up at Louis, a small smile on his face. "Good work. This is exactly the kind of lead we needed." Louis beamed with pride, feeling a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't felt in a long time. "So what's our next move?" Rich stood up, his eyes gleaming with determination. "We set a course for that planet. If this outpost is still out there, we need to find it. It could be the key to everything we've been searching for." Louis nodded, his own excitement growing. "I'll let the others know. We'll be ready to go in no time." As he left Rich's quarters, Louis couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had a lead, a tangible goal to work towards, and with any luck, it would lead them to the new beginning they so desperately needed. Little did he know, however, that the outpost held secrets far darker and more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. And as they set out on their new mission, they were walking into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The ship descended through the atmosphere of the desert planet, its engines kicking up clouds of dust and sand as it approached the coordinates of the abandoned research outpost. The team gathered in the cockpit, their eyes fixed on the desolate landscape that stretched out before them. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Nora asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "It looks like there's nothing out here but sand and rocks." Louis double-checked the coordinates, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is definitely the place. The outpost should be just ahead." As if on cue, a cluster of low, gray buildings appeared on the horizon, their metal surfaces glinting dully in the harsh sunlight. The buildings were surrounded by a high, reinforced wall, topped with coils of razor wire. "There it is," Rich said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Looks like it's still standing, at least." He turned to Nora, who was already preparing the ship for landing. "Bring us in close, but keep the engines running. We don't know what we're walking into here." Nora nodded, her hands flying over the controls as she guided the ship towards the outpost. As they drew closer, the extent of the damage became clear. The walls were pockmarked with scorch marks and blast holes, and several of the buildings had collapsed in on themselves. "Looks like there was a battle here," Trevor remarked, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the ruins. "And not too long ago either." Rich frowned, a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. "Keep your eyes open and your weapons ready. We don't know what might be waiting for us inside." The ship touched down just outside the outpost's walls, and the team quickly disembarked, their weapons drawn and their senses on high alert. They made their way towards the nearest building, a low, squat structure that appeared to have been some kind of research lab. As they approached the entrance, Rich held up a hand, signaling for the others to stop. He peered through the shattered windows, his eyes straining to see through the gloom inside. "I don't see any movement," he said, his voice low and cautious. "But that doesn't mean there's nothing in there. Nora, Trevor, you take point. Louis and I will cover you." The team moved forward, their footsteps echoing loudly in the eerie silence of the abandoned outpost. They entered the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they swept the interior for any signs of life. But there was nothing. The lab was empty, its equipment smashed and its surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years, left to the mercy of the desert sands. As they moved deeper into the outpost, the same scene repeated itself over and over. Empty buildings, ruined equipment, and no sign of the researchers who had once worked there. It was as if they had simply vanished, leaving no trace of their presence behind. But then, as they entered what appeared to be the main research building, they found something that made their blood run cold. The walls were lined with tanks, each one filled with a strange viscous liquid. And floating within those tanks were the twisted, malformed bodies of creatures that could only be described as nightmarish. "What the hell is this?" Luis whispered, his voice trembling with horror. "What were they doing here?" Rich shook his head, his own revulsion and disgust mirrored on the faces of his teammates. "I don't know, but whatever it wasn't good." As they searched the rest of the building, they found more evidence of the horrific experiments that had taken place there. Research notes, data logs, and journals detailing the creation of monstrous hybrids and genetically engineered abominations. And then they found the cages. Dozens of them, lined up in neat rows in a cavernous chamber deep beneath the outpost. Each one was empty, its bars bent and twisted as if something had torn its way out from within. The implications were clear. The creatures they had seen in the tanks hadn't been the only ones. There were more out there, somewhere in the desert oases beyond the outpost's walls. And as the team stood there, staring at the empty cages in horror, they knew that their mission had just become far more dangerous than they ever could have imagined. The team sat in the main research building, their faces grim as they pored over the data they had recovered from the outpost's computers. The more they read, the clearer the picture became. The researchers had been working on something they called Project Chimera, a series of experiments designed to create the ultimate living weapon. But something had gone wrong. The creatures they had created had proven too powerful, too unpredictable. They had broken free of their confinement and rampaged through the outpost, slaughtering the researchers and destroying everything in their path. And now those same creatures were out there, somewhere in the desert wastes, free to roam, to hunt, to kill. "We have to find them," Rich said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "We can't let these things run loose. There's no telling what kind of damage they could do." The others nodded in agreement, their own resolve hardening in the face of the task before them. They gathered their gear and set out into the desert, following the tracks and signs left behind by the creatures. The sun beat down on them mercilessly as they trekked through the sand and rock, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of their quarry. Hours passed, and then days, with no sign of the creatures. But still they pressed on. They had a duty to see this through, to protect the innocent from the horrors that had been unleashed upon the galaxy. And then, on the 5th day, they found them. It was Trevor who spotted the first sign, a strange three-toed footprint in the sand. They followed the trail, their weapons at the ready, until they came upon a narrow canyon, its walls towering high above them. And there at the far end of the canyon, they saw them. A group of the creatures, their twisted, misshapen bodies glistening in the sun. They were gathered around the carcass of some unfortunate animal, tearing at its flesh with their razor-sharp claws. The team approached cautiously, their weapons trained on the creatures. But as they drew closer, the creatures suddenly turned, their eyes fixing on the team with a feral intensity. And then they attacked. They came at the team in a wave of tooth and claw, their twisted forms moving with a speed and agility that belied their monstrous appearance. The team opened fire, their weapons blazing as they tried to keep the creatures at bay. But there were too many of them. For every one that fell, two more seemed to take its place. The team was forced to retreat, back through the canyon and out into the open desert. They made their stand there, their backs to a rocky outcropping as the creatures circled around them. They fought with everything they had, their weapons and their wits the only thing standing between them, and a grisly death. In the end, it was Nora who turned the tide. She spotted a weakness in the creature's defenses, a small gap in their armor that left their vital organs exposed. She took aim and fired, her shots striking true and sending the creatures reeling back in pain. The others followed her lead, targeting the creature's weak spots with ruthless efficiency, and slowly, painfully, they began to turn the tide. When the last of the creatures finally fell, the team stood there, panting and bloodied, their weapons smoking in their hands. They had won, but at a cost. They were battered and bruised, their armor dented and their spirits weary. But as they looked out over the carnage they had wrought, they knew that their mission was far from over. There were still more creatures out there, more abominations born of the researchers' twisted experiments. And they would hunt them down, one by one, until the galaxy was safe once more. The journey back to the outpost was a somber one. The team had emerged victorious from their battle with the creatures, but the cost had been high. They were battered and bruised, their armor dented, and their spirits weary. As they approached the outpost, Rich called a halt. He turned to face his team, his expression grave. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "This place is too exposed, too vulnerable. We need to find somewhere else to regroup and plan our next move." The others nodded in agreement. The outpost had served its purpose, but it was no longer safe. They needed a new base of operations, somewhere they could fortify and defend against the horrors that lurked in the desert wastes. They spent the next few days scouring the surrounding area, searching for a suitable location. And then, on the third day, they found it. It was an old mining complex, nestled deep within a series of winding canyons. The buildings were dilapidated and the equipment rusted, but the walls were thick and the defenses sound. Rich nodded in satisfaction as he surveyed the complex. "This will do," he said, a note of determination in his voice. "We'll make this our new home." And so, they set to work. They cleared the buildings of debris and fortified the walls, turning the complex into a veritable fortress. They scavenged what equipment they could from the outpost and the surrounding area, cobbling together a makeshift workshop and infirmary. Luis worked tirelessly to get the complex's systems up and running, coaxing power from the ancient generators and jury-rigging the communications array to boost their signal. Nora and Trevor took charge of the defenses, setting up perimeter patrols and training the team in new combat tactics to deal with the unique threats they now faced. And Rich planned. He pored over the data they had recovered from the outpost, trying to make sense of the researchers' twisted experiments. He studied the creatures they had encountered, looking for weaknesses and patterns in their behavior. And as the days turned into weeks, the mining complex began to feel like home. The team fell into a routine, each member playing to their strengths and working together like a well-oiled machine. But even as they settled into their new life, they never forgot their mission. They knew that the creatures were still out there, waiting in the shadows, and they knew that they had to be ready for when they returned. Rich stood on the walls of the complex one evening, staring out into the gathering darkness. The desert stretched out before him, vast and empty, hiding untold horrors in its depths. But as he looked back at his team, at the determined faces of his friends and comrades, he felt a flicker of hope. They had faced impossible odds before, and they had emerged stronger for it. And now, with a new home and a renewed sense of purpose, they would face the challenges ahead with the same courage and determination that had brought them this far. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Rich smiled. They had a long road ahead of them, but they would walk it together. The team had settled into their new home, the mining complex now a bustling hive of activity, as they worked to fortify their defenses and plan their next move. But Rich knew that they couldn't do this alone. They needed allies, people they could trust to stand with them against the horrors that lurked in the desert wastes. He gathered his team together in the main hall of the complex, his expression serious. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with pride. "But we can't stop now. We need to expand our ranks, bring in people who share our vision and our values." The others nodded in agreement, their own determination mirrored in their eyes. They knew that the task ahead of them was too great for them to handle alone. Rich turned to Luis. I need you to reach out to our old contacts, anyone who might be sympathetic to our cause. We need people with skills, with resources, anyone who can help us in our fight." Luis nodded, his fingers already flying over his console as he began to compile a list of potential allies. Rich then turned to Nora and Trevor. "I need you two to head out into the surrounding settlements. Spread the word about what we're doing here. We need to let people know that they have a choice, that they don't have to live in fear of the creatures that haunt this planet." Nora and Trevor exchanged a glance, then nodded in unison. They knew that their message would not be an easy one to sell, but they were ready to face the challenge head-on. As the team dispersed to their assigned tasks, Rich sat back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that building an alliance would not be easy, that there would be those who opposed them and their mission. But he also knew that there were people out there who shared their values, who believed in justice and honor and the power of the human spirit. And he was determined to find them, to bring them into the fold and forge a new future for the galaxy. Days turned into weeks as the team worked tirelessly to expand their network of allies. Luis reached out to old friends and former comrades, people he knew could be trusted to keep their secrets and fight by their side. Nora and Trevor ventured out into the settlements, spreading the word of their team and the work they were doing. Some listened with rapt attention, their eyes alight with hope and purpose. Others turned away, too afraid or too jaded to believe in a better future. But slowly, gradually, their ranks began to grow. People from all walks of life, from all corners of the galaxy, began to trickle into the mining complex. Some were former soldiers, like the Remnant angels themselves. Others were civilians, people who had lost everything to the creatures and the chaos that followed the collapse. Rich welcomed them all with open arms, his heart swelling with pride as he saw his vision begin to take shape. These were people who had been beaten down by the galaxy, who had seen the worst that life had to offer. But they had not given up hope, had not lost their will to fight. And as he looked out over the growing crowd of allies and friends, Rich knew that they had a chance. They had the numbers, they had the skills, and most importantly, they had the heart to see this through to the end. And with their new allies by their side, it would face the challenges ahead with renewed strength and purpose. The mining complex was abuzz with activity, the sound of voices and laughter mingling with the hum of machinery and the clatter of weapons. Rich's team had grown, their ranks swelling with new recruits and old friends, all united in their determination to make a difference in the galaxy. Rich stood on a balcony overlooking the main hall, a smile on his face as he watched his team work. Luis was hunched over a console, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked to decrypt a series of encrypted messages they had intercepted. Nora and Trevor were sparring in the training room, their movements fluid and graceful as they honed their skills. And all around them, the new recruits were hard at work, learning the ropes and finding their place in the organization. Some were working on the defenses, reinforcing the walls and setting up new perimeter sensors. Others were in the workshop, tinkering with weapons and gear, looking for ways to give them an edge in the battles to come. As Rich watched them all, he felt a sense of pride and purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. This was what he had been searching for, what he had been fighting for all these years. A chance to make a real difference, to build something that would last. He was shaken from his thoughts by a soft cough behind him. He turned to see Nora standing there, a curious look on her face. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, moving to stand beside him at the railing. Rich shrugged. "Just taking it all in," he said. "Seeing everyone working together like this, it's amazing." Nora nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It is, she agreed. "But you know, there's still one thing we haven't figured out yet." Rich raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what's that?" "The name," Nora said. "For our little group here. We can't just keep calling ourselves the team forever." Rich chuckled. "I suppose you're right," he said. "Any ideas?" Nora shook her head. "I was hoping you might have some." Rich fell silent, his gaze drifting out over the main hall once more. He thought about all they had been through, all the battles they had fought and the sacrifices they had made. He thought about the creatures that still lurked out there in the desert, the horrors that threatened to consume the galaxy if left unchecked. And then, suddenly it came to him. The Remnant Angels, he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. That's what we'll call ourselves. Nora raised an eyebrow. The Remnant Angels. Why that? Rich smiled. Because that's what we are, he said. We're the remnants of the old world, the last line of defense against the darkness that threatens to engulf us all. We're the angels that watch over the innocent, the guardians that stand between the light and the shadow. Nora nodded slowly, a smile spreading across her face. The Remnant Angels, she repeated. I like it. It fits. Rich nodded, his own smile widening. Then that's what we'll be, he said. The Remnant Angels, protectors of the innocent and defenders of the light. And as he spoke those words, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him, a certainty that this was the path they were meant to walk. They had a purpose now, a reason to keep fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. For they were the Remnant Angels, the last hope in a galaxy consumed by darkness. And they would not rest until their mission was complete, until the creatures were vanquished and the innocent were safe once more. As the sun began to set over the mining complex, Rich and Nora made their way down to the main hall, ready to share their new name with the rest of the team. As they walked, Nora turned to Rich, a thoughtful expression on her face. You know, she said, it's kind of interesting how we ended up here, in a mining complex in the middle of these canyons. Rich raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Nora shrugged. Well, think about it. When we first set out to find a new home, to start building something new, we were in a similar spot, surrounded by rocks and sand, in the middle of nowhere. Rich nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're right, he said. It's almost poetic, in a way. Like we've come full circle. Nora grinned. Exactly. And now, here we are, ready to start a new chapter in our lives. Ready to become something more than just survivors. Rich reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. The Remnant Angels, he said, his voice filled with pride and determination. Protectors of the innocent, defenders of the light. Nora nodded, her own eyes shining with the same fierce resolve. And we'll do it together, she said. As a team, as a family. Rich smiled, his heart swelling with love and gratitude for the woman beside him, and the team that awaited them in the main hall. Always, he said. And as they walked hand in hand into the heart of their new home, Rich knew that they had a long road ahead of them, and the battles to come would be fierce and bloody. But with their new allies by their side and a renewed sense of purpose in their hearts, he knew that they would prevail. If Rich's dreams played out, the Remnant Angels would change the tides of the galaxy, and he hoped they might change the course of history for the better as well. I hope you enjoyed this installment in the Remnant Angels series. If you did, be sure to give it a like and subscribe too. Keep an eye out for the next video in this series.